am interviewing Mary Kathryn Jensen at her home in the village of Withee, and the date is November 11th, 2009. I am Louise Rasmussen-Oshevsky. We will be talking to her about her family life and area history. Mary Kathryn, would you tell us where and when you were born and about your early life and parents?
I was born in the town of Maplehurst, Taylor County, in what had been intended to be a store building. Maplehurst didn't get to be a village, and my grandparents and parents moved to Wisconsin in 1919 and bought the store building to live in while they cleared the land that they had bought. It was bare, cut-over land with pine stumps and rocks and swamps, and they lived in part of the store building and tore the rest of it down and used the lumber, the windows, and the doors for the house that we eventually lived in. I was born June 22nd, 1921, and we lived there. I don't remember just when we moved to the house, but my two sisters were born in the house in 1923 and 1926. My parents were Rex and Scotch Copper. My grandparents were David and Mary Copper. And they moved to Wisconsin because land had gone so high priced in Illinois that they couldn't afford to rent nor buy land. And Grandpa bought a quarter of a section of land and thought he was going to develop a corporation farm for the family with my dad and his brother and sister and her husband. Well, they started and they were clearing the land, and there wasn't enough cash income for 4 families, so my aunt and uncle moved to Chippewa Falls, and my dad's brother, Uncle Ross, moved to Cornell and eventually to Chicago area. Dad and Grandpa farmed the land together as a partnership until 1935. We all lived together in that house. I don't know how much more you want.
Okay, you mentioned you had some other siblings too.
Yes, I had a sister, Maureen, two and a half years younger than me, and Dorothy, 5 years younger.
Dorothy Clobbin.
Dorothy Clobbin and Maureen Stewart were my sisters. Maureen passed away in 1998, and Dorothy still lives here in Withee.
Where did you have your early education? What training did you have?
I walked a mile to the Maplehurst School. I think it was District number 7, as I remember it, which was near the Cortland Hamill farm, and graduated from 8th grade there. Then I went to Withee to high school, boarded in town. There were no school buses. I boarded in town with Natalie Scherf and her mother, and went to the 4 years of high school. And then I went to Stevens Point, to Central State Teachers College at Stevens Point, which is now University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, in 1938 and 1938-39 and 1939-40. I took a rural teaching course, and then I began my life. It wasn't my life work, but I began my work as a teacher.
And where did you teach?
My first year of teaching was in the southwest corner of Taylor County, the Westland School in the town of Taft. I had 42 children in all 8 grades. If you want more about that. That year, about 6 weeks after school started, the State Department of Health doctor came to my door and said, "We have to examine these children and see what's here. We've been reported there's a case of scarlet fever, so I have to examine the children." Well, she went through the school up and down the rows and examined them in most stages of scarlet fever. She said, "We have to close the school." So the school board paid me to clean up the schoolroom and air the books and scrub the desks while the children were all at home recuperating. There the children were all but three, one family of children, walked to school. The rest were all transported in a homemade school bus because most of them lived so far from the schoolhouse. I got $85 a month for teaching. I had to build my own fires, and by the children all being transported, I had to do my own janitor work, sweeping and emptying water and carrying in water, and I boarded 3/4 of a mile from the school and walked to school every morning.
From there, where did you go to teach?
Then the second year, I taught the Willowdale School, or known as the Munson School, which was
now it's on Sydney Avenue.
It was 4 miles west of, I think it's 4, west of T, County Trunk T, in the town of Hickson. On Sydney Avenue, it's where Sydney Avenue has been named for the road now, but the Woods and Cardinals lived on that road. I had 10 children there, and I hardly knew what to do with myself. So then, that year, I did get, I think I started with $100 a month there, which was quite a difference from $85 for 42 pupils. And that year, the school board decided that it was too expensive to try to pay the expenses of running a school when they were entitled to, when the school bus went by and all the children could be transported to the Withee School District, so they consolidated with the Withee School District, closed the school. And then the next year, which was 1941, I went to the 42. I went to the White School, located 4 miles north of Withee, on County Trunk T. 5 miles, I guess it is, isn't it? I think so. And I taught there for 3 years. I had from 23 to 28 pupils through the years there. And I ended up teaching, I was getting about $225 a month by the time I ended.
Whatever happened to Willowdale School?
The Willowdale School building, after they closed it, the Willowdale School was, the Danish Brotherhood from Withee bought the school building and moved it into Withee after they had had a fire and burned their hall down. And now it is a residence in Withee, on the corner of School and Dana Street.
I couldn't remember which street it was. During your younger days, what kind of recreation did they have around here? Were there movies or radio, dances, parties? What did you do for recreation?
Well, there were band concerts during the summer months. There was a bandstand in Withee, and the high school band played on, I think it was Wednesday nights during the summer, and on Saturday nights and eventually Friday nights, they ran free movies in the park at Withee. There were dance halls out in the country. There was Merry Old Gardens and Shady Nook. And
where were those located?
Well, Shady Nook was located in the town of Maplehurst, down along the Black River, south of, off of County Trunk T, in the town of Maplehurst, and that floated away in a flood in 1943. And Mariel Gardens was about 4 miles south of Withee, on the right-hand side of State Highway 73, in the neighborhood of the Misslings. And there was a dance hall at Colby. There was a dance hall a mile away at Thorpe, which was north of Thorpe, across the road from was Club 73. It's a restaurant, tavern.
Were there many cars around here where people could get to those dance halls, or how did they get there?
Well, by the time those dance halls were in full swing, almost everybody had some sort of a car. When I grew up, there weren't very many cars in our neighborhood while I went to grade school. No, most of the families didn't have cars. There were only 3 or 4 in the neighborhood, and they shared their cars with taking other people to town for their groceries if they needed to. Where I lived in the town of Maplehurst, it was 10 miles to Withee, and 4 miles to Redville, 4 miles to Clark, where there were little general stores at Clark and Redville.
Did your family do most of the shopping in the Redville area, or come into Withee?
Most of the shopping was done more at Clark than at Redville, because my dad hauled logs to the sawmill at Clark through the early years. He cut wood all winter, and bolts, he called them, logs, hauled them to the sawmill at Clark, and then he would bring feed home for his animals on the sled when he came home from there. On his way, he would let the children that lived north of the Clark school ride on the load of logs to school at Clark, and on the way home, it took all day with his load of logs to be sawed up, and then he would take the children back that lived north, the Hauschults and the Swensons and the Kwiatkowskis, rode the sled back home to their homes on his way to home.
That sounds like fun.
They all remember that.
Did you have any, any hobbies that you, even now, what hobbies do you have?
Well, I don't know that I really had too many hobbies as a child. We belonged to the 4-H club and had sewing projects going all year, and canning and baking. I did collect some stamps. I didn't make it a serious project, but I have a scrapbook of stamps that I have made. And
who was the 4-H leader?
My mother was one of the 4-H leaders. To start the 4-H club, my mother helped with the leader, and then after that took over and was the leader for over 25 years in the area. We had a 4-H club that was joint Clark and Taylor County 4-H club, so we exhibited both at Neilsville and at Medford at the county fairs. I went to the 4-H camp at Neilsville Fair almost every year that I was in, and I was a member for 10 years of the 4-H club. And then after that, I was a leader of the 4-H club for almost 10 years. In the different school districts that I had 4-H going.
From all of those 4-H experiences, what do you still use now? What do you do now that you learned then?
Right now, I'm doing crocheting and knitting. I did a lot of sewing while my family was growing up. But when the wash and wear materials came in to use, I didn't do as much sewing as I did before, but I made all of the children's clothes, boys' suits, shirts, pajamas, and all of my daughter's clothes until she got tall enough that it took 3 or 4 pieces of clothing to rip up and make for her. I ripped up old clothing and hand-me-down clothing and made clothes for her.
So you had your 4-H came in very handy.
Oh
as far as
yes,
sewing.
yes. And my daughter learned to sew when she took over her own sewing or got someone to sew for. She went away to school, but then she had someone do sewing for her.
I know you do beautiful crocheting because right here today you have a ripple.
I've made over 100 Afghans that are at least 54 by 75 inches, and a lot of baby Afghans, some baby sweaters, a few vests for myself and others, and lap robes. I have kept track of most of the ones that I made and have pictures of them in scrapbook.
You do keep busy then.
Yes, I keep busy. I'm not one that likes to just sit down and not do anything. I read a lot. I've always read a lot.
Now, going back a little ways, do you remember who the first president was you voted for? Probably Roosevelt?
No. Yes. Well, I didn't vote for Roosevelt, but it was...
Or that who was...
Yes, whoever ran against him. Wilkie, I think, maybe.
Herbert Hoover.
No, that's when I was born. No, I wasn't old enough for Hoover. Would have been 1942.
Okay, it would have been... Would have been, 45 was Roosevelt, it was Truman, and then 33 to 45 was Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover. Yeah, well, you did vote though, when you were able to.
As I remember, I have voted every year since I was old enough to vote.
Yeah, you're just a good citizen, that's good.
I feel it is my duty.
Do you remember your first car ride? Or did you just always, you never had a horse and sleigh and...
Well, we had a car, but we didn't use it in the wintertime. It was put up on blocks. We had a 1917 Model T Ford that was put on blocks in the wintertime. I can remember seeing it in the shed. And in winter we had a driving horse and had a cutter and went everywhere, either with the team and big sleigh, logging sleigh, or with the cutter and riding horse. Or we didn't go anyplace. We stayed home.
Especially if there was a snowstorm.
And then in 1926 we got a new Model T Ford. And as I remember, I think they used that in the wintertime, but the roads were terrible. They weren't, the upkeep on the roads wasn't done. There just wasn't any snow plowing, and in the spring and summer, it was just a few months in the summer that the roads were passable with a car for the 10 miles that it took us to drive to town.
With all the mud holes.
Oh, there were terrible spring holes all along, all of the full length of County Trunk T from Withee out to Maplehurst. And north of Maplehurst, up toward 64, there were terrible spring holes, and there was a swamp that was overflowing with water a lot of the time. And it was 18 miles to Medford, the county seat. We didn't do too much of that, going places.
Okay, do you remember the first movie that you may have seen? Or one of the early ones?
I think it was Tom Sawyer, and it was at the Owen Theater. There was a time when the Medford Theater gave out tickets for the children from grade school to attend a movie. I don't remember what that was, and I think we went, but there were too many of our families and didn't have any way to go from school. Our teacher was from Medford, and I I have an idea that she took us to the theater at Medford. A carload, as many as could go, she probably took us up there. But I think the movie was Tom Sawyer, as I remember it. Then there was a theater in Owen. I don't know when the theater started in Owen, but we did get to go once in a great while to the movie in Owen.
Do you remember when when you had electricity or the telephone?
There was no telephone in my home at Maplehurst as long as I lived there. The telephone line had been out as far as the Larson farm or the Searcy farm on the Clark Road. Larson farm was on County Trunk T. But when the telephone raised the price, they took their phones out. Then the closest telephone was the Redville store or the Clark store. And after I was married, and my folks had moved away from Maplehurst, the telephone line went through out at Maplehurst, which was after 1944. The electricity was Clark Electrical Company turned the electricity on for us 2 weeks before I graduated from high school in 1938. My dad had worked for the Clark Electric, getting easements from all the farmers from Neilsville to Perkinstown in all directions around. He called on all the farmers to sign easements so they could run the lines through from 1934 to we got the lines built through. And then he served on the board of directors of the Clark Electric for probably 20 years.
Because people weren't able to get into town very easily, if you were sick, what type of home remedies did your mother use?
Well, when we showed signs of getting a cold, my mother would get a quart of tomatoes, canned tomatoes, and say, "Now this is for you, and by tonight you have it all gone." And that usually took care of our cold. We didn't have too much sickness. When I had quite a bit of croup when I would get a cold, and my grandmother was a great home remedy fixer. She had sliced onions and sprinkled sugar over the onions and set it in the warming oven of the stove. And then if we started coughing, she'd give us a teaspoonful of that onion syrup, and it really settled our cough. I remember her holding me over a pan of steaming water with a cloth over my head so the steam loosened up the cough too. And we had mentholatum, Vicks VapoRub, cough syrup probably from the McConnens man or the Watkins man, who were regular callers at our home. And other than that, we just didn't have too much.
I think some of those same old remedies still work, actually. I don't know about the onions with sugar, but...
Well, I can taste it, yeah. It wasn't bad. Of course, we thought it was terrible.
Yeah, at the time. Now, you were married, and how did you meet your spouse, and what was his name?
My husband was Earl Jensen. He was in the neighborhood from the white school area, and I boarded at his folks through the winter months when I was teaching at the white school. I guess we went to a movie or a dance at Jackson's Burial Gardens, and then from there it led to marriage.
When and where were you married, and how long?
I was married in July 1948, and in my home in the Frenchtown area. My folks had moved from Maplehurst to Frenchtown that summer, Dad sold the farm at Maplehurst and moved closer to town on better roads, and I just married. In fact, it was the same week that they moved to the Frenchtown home that was my wedding.
So you were married how long then?
52 and a half years.
Congratulations. What occupation did your husband have?
2 weeks after we were married, my husband bought a milk route. He had worked for his dad on the farm, and they were not willing to turn it over for us to farm it. But he continued to work for them even after we bought the milk route, and we rented a house in the White School District, and he bought a canned milk route.
Where did he haul the milk to?
He hauled the milk to White House Milk Company in Abbotsford. He had quite a route through all of the Frenchtown area, the White School area, even up into Maplehurst. I don't remember how many patrons he started with, but it was a big load. There were times when he made 2 trips a day through the summer months to get all the milk hauled in because of the flush in the summer months when they put the cows out to pasture.
How long did he do that?
He hauled milk for 11 years. And at that time he had started to do, we had bought a farm, we were farming, and he was hauling milk, and then he started to factory work at Post Company, Teledyne Post Company, and he was working 8 to 10 hours at night, coming home and getting a little rest and getting back on the road, and we decided that was not good to have that many hours of work. So then he sold the milk route and just did factory work and farm work. He worked at Teledyne Post for 25 years.
Do you remember anything about VJ Day or Pearl Harbor, or when Kennedy was shot, assassinated? Were you in any particular place that you remember?
Well, VJ Day, we were very excited. Earl's 2 brothers and a brother-in-law were in the service. His brother Jens had been in the South Pacific almost 3 years without being home, and they came home, and the other brother had come home. He'd been to England and Germany during the Second World War, and Jens had come home in May before VJ Day, and our life was about the same with the farming and doing things for Earl's parents until the boys came home, and then they decided they were going to take over on the farm, which relieved Earl because he had too many irons in the fire. VJ Day, we danced in the Kit Kat bar over towards Thorpe with a group of friends when we heard the announcement.
Everybody was partying.
Yes, everybody partied everywhere. And the day that Kennedy was killed, I had been working at the school. I started working after my 3rd child was ready for grade school. I started working at the school in the hot lunch program. I worked in the kitchen, and I went down the day I was on my way to a birthday coffee with the cooks. The day that Kennedy was shot, I had taken a leave of absence from the school lunch program because I was pregnant and going to be at home the rest of the time. Everyone was shook up terribly when Kennedy was shot. Then my fourth child was born in January, and I really didn't see going back to work at that time. I wanted to be with I had been at home with the other three children, and I wanted to be home with them. This one the same. So I stayed home until he was about 5 years old, and the plant that we sold our milk to filed bankruptcy, and the workers at Teledyne Post were on strike, and our income was almost down to nil. So I applied for work at the Clark County Health Care Center and didn't get called. So then when the strike was over at the post company, I went in and worked at post company for 10 years. Right after I started working at the post company, Mr. Mills called me to come to work at the Clark County Health Care Center, but I had joined the union and I wasn't going to lose that money that I had paid into the union, and I just decided. I had been offered a job to teach at one time through the years while I was at the school kitchen work, but I decided it wasn't worth it to me because I had not had enough education to go back to teach at that time, although I probably could have. A lot of the older women went back to teach, but I just couldn't see that. I would have to have a second car. I would have to go to night school or summer school the rest of my life probably, and besides that, the rules and regulations for teaching was more than I could handle to go back to teach school.
Now, you mentioned that you had 4 children. What were their names, and if they're married now, what are their married names? What occupations do they have?
My daughter Shirley was born in 1945. She graduated from the Withee High School, went to the University of Wisconsin, and from there she decided she wanted to go to the Southwest to teach. She qualified for the California teachers, and she got a position teaching in the Los Angeles area, and she taught 39 years in the same school district, and now is retired. She married in 1973, but the marriage didn't work out. She has no children, but she's doing other work and enjoys a lot of travel. And Marvin was born in 1946. He went into the Marines out when he was a senior in high school and was gone for 4 years. And while he was gone, he was in California for basic training, and then he was in North Carolina and Hawaii and Cuba and back to Hawaii, and from there he went to Vietnam for 13 months, came home in 1968 and worked for different areas. Worked at Land O'Lakes at one time, worked for Hutman Heating, and drove over-the-road truck driving for over 15 years. He was married the year after he came home, and he has one son who lives in North Dakota, and he has 2 little girls, which are my great-granddaughters. Marvin lives here in Withee and is my right-hand caretaker. Alan was born in July in 1952, and he graduated from high school here at Withee, Withee. Went to school a year at Stout, University of Wisconsin Stout. Then he enlisted in the Army, and was in the Army for about 10 years. During his service in the Army, he was in Germany for 3 years. He was married and had 2 little children while he was in here, and then went to Germany with the 2 little children, and came back, stationed down in Louisiana, and then he was divorced when the children were 10 and 12 about. He had been a recruiter for the Army for a few years, but he got out of the Army, gave it up, and took a job, works for Lockheed Martin in Texas. He lives near Dallas, but he has his family, his children live near. He has 2 little grandsons that are my great-grandsons, and he's married again. He was divorced from the mother of the children. Lives not too far from where they are. And then I have David, born in 1964. He graduated from Withee High School and went in the Air Force right out of high school and served 20 years in the United States Air Force. Is retired from the Air Force, where he was a jet engine mechanic. Lived in New Jersey for a few years, and is married and lives in Tennessee now with 2 children. And after his wife retired from 25 years of police work in New Jersey, he has 20 years Air Force retirement, and he's working again now at repairing jet engines, and he loves it.
Sounds like everyone is busy.
And they are very busy, they're very healthy, and they are very good about calling me at least once a week. They've all been home at different times. They had a big open house for me on my 80th birthday.
Now, you keep very busy, but you did belong to some organizations in the community. What organizations were those?
I belong to the PTA at Frenchtown. I belong to the Frenchtown Homemakers Club. And I was a member of the Eastern Star at Owen I joined in 1939. I have been a member of the Eastern Star. I was many officers in the Eastern Star. I didn't take any active part for office work in the other organizations, but.
Was your mother involved with the Eastern Star?
My mother was an Eastern Star, and my dad was a Mason, and they were active. My mother was the first Eastern Star in the Owen Lodge, because she had joined in Illinois before she was married.
Any other organizations that you belong to? A church in the area also?
Well, I belong to the United Church of Christ and have been active in the women's work, the Women's Fellowship of the Eastern Star.
Have you received some awards along the way for all the good things that you've done?
No special awards, except awards to myself for being active and doing things and keeping going.
Well, I think that's important, actually. But I know that you've been active in the community doing things, and with, like you say, with the church and Eastern Star, and sometimes that's just a self reward that
It
you
is.
could do
That's the
good
way
for
I
other people.
That's the way I feel about all of the work that I have done, and looking after my in-laws and my parents when they got old, and a couple of my neighbors lived to be in their 90s and 100, and I helped take care of them.
And every time you give someone a quilt or a lap robe, that's very rewarding for the person receiving it. Did you ever meet anyone that was a famous person?
I shook Richard Nixon's hand
Well,
when he was in Wausau one time. It was, I don't know if it was when he was running for president or if it was, I can't remember that, but I went with Agnes Peterson to Wausau to a rally and shook Richard Nixon's hand. Other than that, I haven't had any famous people that I know of.
well, that's pretty famous. To what do you owe your longevity?
Positive thinking,
You definitely
living moderately, and doing what I can to help others. Keeps me going.
If you were to give advice to young people today, if they would listen, what would you tell them?
Get all the education you can get, and get a varied education. Don't go down one line. Learn a little bit about everything, in other words, and live a good life and help to learn to serve others.
That's very good advice. Anything else that you would like to say today that we haven't covered?
Well, I thank my parents and my grandparents for helping me grow up to think the way I do and live the way I do.
And you have good genes also.
Well, I think I have, although I've lived longer than any of my parents or any of my grandparents.
Well, I want to thank you very much for participating in our oral history, and you are a valuable part of our area history because you have given us some insight into things that are not in history books. And so we really appreciate that, and thank you for sharing your past with us.
You're welcome.